For as long as I can remember, my mouth has gotten me into trouble. So, just as an example, a couple of my earliest memories actually involve biting people with my mouth. I was a biter. I don't know why. I once bit my sister so hard, my mom didn't know what to do. She just said, "Your dad's going to have to deal with that when he gets home." She sent me to my room, and I was so scared at the consequences for having done what I did, which I knew was wrong, that I climbed out my window and ran away. They actually found me in the alley behind our house hours later, I think. Another time, I bit my cousin on the back. Again, I don't know why I did it, but if I remember correctly, that was the first time I got my mouth washed out with soap. Yeah. So the second time I got my mouth washed out with soap was for a different kind of offense. So this is one of my mom's favorite stories, and she still remembers this. It was the time that me and my friend from up the street, whose name was Chris Walraven, we were yelling curse words into the fan of the air conditioner behind our house. So you know how it sounds funny when you talk into a fan, right? Well, as a 6-year-old, I thought it was hilarious to say cuss words, all the cuss words I could think of, into this fan, shouting it into the fan, which of course was reverberating through the house. And it was also right under the window of my next door neighbor, who wasn't very nice. I thought it was funny. She didn't think it was funny at all. Now, I'd like to say that I grew up and my mouth never got me into any more trouble, but that would be a lie, because I had what you might call a smart mouth, okay? I talked back to my parents and sometimes to my teachers, but somehow we all survived. My parents survived, so did I, and I think a lot of it has to do with their patience and their love. Eventually, I learned to use my smart mouth in smarter ways, for good and for God. Or at least that's my goal. That's always my goal. I don't always get it right. I don't know that anybody does. But like the psalmist, I pray, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So that's my prayer, especially when I stand up here and talk to all of you, when I preach. And it should be your prayer too, even if you never preach a single sermon. What we say, and even more importantly, why we say it, is important to God. The book of Proverbs alone has more than 150 references to our lips, mouths, and tongues. So many of those are warnings about using our words in harmful ways. But some of them are about the power of words to bless and to build up. For instance, we read in Proverbs 16, pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. Or from chapter 12, an anxious heart weighs a man down, but kind words cheer him up. Or one of my favorites, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. When I was growing up, my mom had a book of poetry called Apples of Gold, and I never knew where that image came from until I happened across it in Proverbs. The right word at the right time can make all the difference in the world. Words can be healing. Words can offer guidance. They can help us find or stay on the path of wisdom. But words can also have a dark side. Now, I didn't do a side-by-side comparison between the Proverbs that are more about the warning of words than those that highlight the good that they can do, but I'm pretty sure there's a whole lot more of the warnings. For instance, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are His delight. According to Solomon, God doesn't have a whole lot of patience with liars. It's a theme. It comes up again and again. A lying tongue hates its victims, and a flattering mouth works ruin. Solomon wanted his son and wants us to know as well that words can ruin people's lives. Words have consequences. A fool's lips bring him strife, Conflict, right? If you're always in conflict in your life, you might want to check yourself, right? Right? Check yourself. A fool's lips bring him strife, and his mouth invites a beating. And I can confirm that. Right? When I was a kid, my smart mouth earned me more than a few of those. Believe me, clear up into high school. But it doesn't end there. There are lots of other ways our speech can get us into trouble. In Proverbs, expressing anger is a big one, a real big one. Solomon writes, "A fool gives vent to anger, but the wise quietly holds it back." So a wise person understands that when you hold your tongue, the anger often passes. Giving vent to it, right, usually just makes the situation worse. By venting, I know you've experienced this, by venting, you actually make yourself angrier. I've watched people vent their anger and just get madder and madder. The more they talk about it, the angrier they get. So not only do you make yourself angry, you make everybody else angry too. That's how it works. So next time you're tempted to fly off the handle, remember, it's probably not the wisest move. Take a deep breath. Keep that mouth closed, because more often than not, that is the path of wisdom. Another big topic in Proverbs about our speech is gossip. Solomon writes, "A perverse person spreads strife, and a gossip separates close friends." A wise person once told me this: if a person is willing to gossip with you, they'll also be likely to gossip about you. It's true. It's absolutely true. Which is why Solomon writes, "A gossip betrays a confidence, so avoid anyone who talks too much," especially about that kind of stuff. So when it comes to gossip, the best thing to do whenever it's possible is to avoid it. That's the best move. But if somebody gossips to you, let it stop there. Be the place where rumors go to die. You should be that place where it stops, always. Because as Solomon writes, without wood, a fire goes out. Without a gossip, a quarrel dies down. Once again, keeping your mouth closed is almost always the best strategy. Whereas Mark Twain once said, it's better to keep your mouth shut and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and prove it. There's a reason so many Proverbs contain warnings about the danger of words. Like Janelle said in her children's message, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," is a lie. That is a lie. Anyone who's ever been bullied, anybody who's ever been gossiped about knows what damage words can do. Again, we're not talking about correction or discipline. We're talking about abuse. Solomon even went so far as to say death and life are in the power of the tongue. The New Testament letter of James says essentially the same thing. We read in chapter 3, "So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great exploits. How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. The tongue is placed among our members as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body, sets on fire the cycle of nature, and is itself set on fire by hell. For every species of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by the human species, but no one can tame the tongue, a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this ought not to be so." Sometimes when a person lets loose with a particularly offensive string of profanities, somebody will say, "Do you kiss your mother with that mouth?" You ever heard that before? That's basically what James is saying there in chapter 3. When you praise God with your mouth one minute and then turn around and curse your brother or sister who's made in God's image the next, that's a problem. As he says, it ought not to be so. It ought not to be so. Your tongue is a fire. And like Smokey the Bear says, only you can prevent forest fires. Now, having said all of that, let me also say this. Using our word for good, and even for God, isn't about speech that's always as pure as the driven snow. It's not even about using speech that's always maybe even G-rated. Some of the world's most evil people are quite well spoken. They put on a good show, especially when they know people are watching. And of course, the opposite is also true. Some of the kindest and wisest people I've ever known sometimes say things that sound a little coarse, maybe even profane. For the last couple of weeks, I've been talking about my grandma on my mom's side of the family, who was wise in lots and lots of ways, which is why she keeps coming up. She was also pretty colorful with her language. I don't know if any of you have a grandma like that, but those are the fun grandmas. So she even had some of her own sayings, her own proverbs, if you will, but one of my favorites was, "Don't stir a turd." Okay? Just think about that one for a minute. So what happens when you do that? What happens when you stir, right? They're going to stink. That's the whole point. So basically her point was, if somebody is obviously grumpy, if they're out of sorts, just leave them alone. Don't stir them up or they're going to stink. That's how it works. So that little bit of wisdom has taken me a long way. It's one I taught my kids too. Now, of course, she could have said the same thing in a way that was less crude, but it wouldn't have been nearly as memorable. Guarantee it. Wouldn't have been nearly as memorable. Just because something or someone sounds a little crude doesn't mean that their speech can't be used for good. I've got an old friend that fits into that same category. We went to seminary together back in the mid-1980s, and she was one of the brightest students in our class. She was smart and funny, and we got to be friends right away. She also cussed like a sailor, no doubt about it. She couldn't help it. It just came naturally to her. After we graduated from seminary, she decided to go back to school, and she got her medical degree. So then she worked for a doctor for several decades, actually, and now she's retired on a beach in North Carolina, and I couldn't be happier for her. Unless something has changed drastically, I'm pretty sure she still cusses like a sailor. I can't imagine that she ever changed. But her heart is in the right place, always has been, which is why her church members loved her, despite all that, years ago, and it's why her patients loved her all the time she was working. They loved her, and she never edited herself at all. In Jesus' time, the Pharisees were well-spoken. You know they were, but it was all for show. As Jesus pointed out, many of them were like whitewashed tombs. On the surface, they were pure and clean, but on the inside, they were filled with corruption and death. They talked a good game, but in the end, they were just in it for themselves. It reminds me of the third commandment. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. I've always believed that this commandment is the most misunderstood of all the commandments. Most people think it's about cussing, right? It's about using God's name as a profanity. And well, that's a part of it. It's just a small part of it. What it's really about is attaching God's name and God's reputation to something that isn't godly. In other words, if you claim to represent God, but then you lie and cheat and steal, that's a problem. If you call yourself a Christian and then treat people cruelly and abusively and think that's a good thing, you're misrepresenting God. You're using God's name in vain. And in my opinion, that's way worse than a few stray curse words. It just is. Things aren't always as they seem. Jesus made it clear throughout his ministry, he was more concerned about the state of our hearts than even the content of our speech. Because whatever starts in the heart eventually makes its way into the world. Good and evil start here and then find their way into our lives. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says this, "For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." The good person brings good things out of a good treasure. And the evil person brings evil things out of an evil treasure. I tell you, on the day of judgment, you will have to give an account for every careless word you utter, for by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. In the end, we will be known for our fruits. Our own words and actions will either justify us or condemn us. So, we've got two options, as far as I can tell. We can try to clean up our act and at least look good, right? Which is, I guess, is better than nothing. Or we can get to the root of things. We can submit ourselves fully to God, which starts in our hearts, and then let God take it from there, right? Because it's not about perfection. We never get there anyway. We never get to perfection. It's not about that. It's about faith. It's about trying to take that path of wisdom all the time. It's about giving everything we are to God and course correcting when we need to. There's a hymn we sang actually this morning at our 9 o'clock service called "Take My Life and Let It Be." And it's such a beautiful description of what a life that's surrendered to God looks like. In one verse it says, "Take my hands and let them move at the impulse of thy love. Take my feet and let them be swift and beautiful for thee." In another verse it says, "Take my silver and my gold, not a mite would I withhold." And in the verse I was thinking about for today, it says, "Take my voice and let me sing, only always for my King. Take my lips and let them be filled with messages for thee." When you submit your heart to God, everything else follows, including your speech. C.S. Lewis compared this process to inviting a carpenter to come into your house and do a little bit of remodeling. So at first you think he's just going to come in, he's going to fix a couple of things, he's going to make things look a little bit nicer, a little more presentable when you have company. But the next thing you know, he's changing everything. He's tearing down walls, and he's opening things up, and he's building on additions, and basically what he's doing, he's preparing it to move in, to live there. That's how God works in us. The way we talk simply reveals how far along the carpenter is in the work. Our words either reveal an underlying disease or a heart that's in the process of being transformed. Not completed, but in the process of being transformed. The path to which we're called is not always the easiest, and I guarantee it is not the most commonly traveled. It's also not something we can do for ourselves. So choose the path you will take. Allow God to remake you from the inside out, including the words of your mouth, so that your words will be like apples of gold in a setting of silver. Choose the path of wisdom, and you will not only be blessed, but you will be a blessing.